The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. As Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his goggles and checked his fuel gauge one final time. It was June 4, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before him, concealing what would become the most decisive naval battle in modern history. Unknown to the Japanese armada steaming confidently toward Midway atoll, American codebreakers had already sealed their fate. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in the command center at Pearl Harbor, his weathered hands gripping intelligence reports that would change the course of the war. The Japanese code JN-25 had been cracked, revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap at Midway. What Yamamoto didn't know was that he was sailing directly into a counter-trap, orchestrated by American intelligence. The Japanese First Air Fleet, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, approached Midway with supreme confidence. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the backbone of the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. These floating fortresses had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, and their pilots were among the most experienced in the world. The rising sun flags fluttered proudly in the Pacific breeze as Admiral Nagumo reviewed his battle plans aboard the flagship Akagi on Midway itself. Marine defenders prepared for what they knew would be a desperate fight. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's 22nd Marine Aircraft Group had been reinforced with every available aircraft, including obsolete Buffalo fighters and Vindicator dive bombers. The tiny atoll, barely 2 miles long, would have to hold against the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As reported in the Chicago Tribune's post-war analysis, the American strategy relied entirely on timing and surprise. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, positioned his carriers Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17, centered on the Yorktown, took station to the northwest. The stage was set for the greatest naval ambush in history. The Japanese plan seemed flawless on paper. Yamamoto's combined fleet would strike Midway, forcing the Americans to commit their remaining carriers to defend the vital base. Once the American fleet was destroyed, Japan would control the Central Pacific, potentially forcing the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. The main body, including Yamamoto's massive battleship Yamato, would deliver the crushing blow once the American carriers were eliminated. But intelligence officer Joseph Rockford and his team at Station Hypo had given the Americans an unprecedented advantage. Every Japanese move had been anticipated, every formation plotted. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, radar operators on Midway detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. The trap was about to be sprung. Commander John Waldron gathered his torpedo squadron pilots aboard the Hornet for their final briefing. He knew the odds were against them. Their obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers would have to penetrate layers of Japanese fighter cover to reach the enemy carriers. Many would not return. As he looked into the young faces of his airmen, Waldron spoke with quiet conviction. We have a chance to turn the tide of this war. Don't let it slip away. The pieces were in position. In less than 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer its most catastrophic defeat, marking the beginning of Japan's irreversible decline in the Pacific War. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness over the Pacific was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had turned into the wind, and the first wave of Japanese attackers was launching for their assault on Midway. 108 aircraft Kate bombers, Val dive bombers, and 0 fighters climbed into the star-filled sky, their engines synchronized in a deadly symphony of war. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike formation toward the distant atoll, unaware that American radar had already detected their approach. On Midway, air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as Marine pilots scrambled to their aircraft. The obsolete Buffalo fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 221, led by Major Floyd Parks, climbed desperately to intercept the incoming armada. The aerial battle that followed was a massacre. The Japanese Zeros, flown by combat veterans, with hundreds of flight hours, systematically destroyed the American defenders. Major Park's Buffalo fighters, designed for training rather than combat, proved woefully inadequate against the superior Japanese aircraft. Within minutes, most of the Marine fighters were either destroyed or badly damaged. The sky above Midway filled with smoke trails and falling debris as the unequal contest played out. Despite the aerial carnage, the Marines on the ground fought with desperate courage. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the Japanese formation approached, their shells bursting like deadly flowers against the morning sky. The Japanese bombers pressed their attack with professional precision, targeting the airfield, fuel storage, facilities, and defensive positions. Explosions rocked the tiny island as bombs found their marks, sending columns of black smoke spiraling upward. But Tomonaga's pilots faced unexpected resistance. The Americans had dispersed their aircraft and strengthened their defenses. Since the Pearl Harbor attack, many Japanese bombs fell on empty revetments or dummy installations. As the strike formation regrouped for their return flight, Tomonaga radioed a fateful message to Admiral Nagumo: there is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission would prove decisive. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His second wave of aircraft was armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking enemy ships. The primary mission, to launch a second strike against Midway, would require rearming with high-explosive bombs, a process that would take at least an hour. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, American torpedo bombers were already in the air, racing toward his fleet. The American counterattack began with a series of piecemeal assaults that seemed destined for failure. At 0705, 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway, led by Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling, found the Japanese fleet. The inexperienced pilots pressed their attack against overwhelming odds, flying their brand-new aircraft directly into the concentrated fire of the entire Japanese formation. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down, their crews lost in the Pacific's depths. As the morning progressed, more American aircraft arrived over the Japanese fleet in uncoordinated attacks. Army B-26 Marauders, Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Navy torpedo planes from the carriers all struck at Nagumo's force. Each attack was beaten off with heavy losses, but they accomplished something crucial: they kept the Japanese carriers maneuvering violently, preventing them from launching their own strike aircraft. The Japanese pilots returning from Midway landed aboard their carriers to report mixed results. The airfield was damaged, but operational, and a second strike would indeed be necessary. As mechanics rushed to rearm the aircraft on the hangar decks below, Admiral Nagumo made his fateful decision. He ordered the torpedo and armor-piercing bombs removed from his reserve aircraft and replaced with high-explosive bombs. For the second Midway strike, the timing could not have been worse. At 0800 hours, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the American fleet. The pilot's radio crackled with the electrifying message: enemy fleet sighted. Composition: 5 cruisers, 5 destroyers, course 050, speed over 20 knots. The message was incomplete. The pilot had failed to identify any aircraft carriers. Nagumo now faced an impossible situation. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed for the second Midway strike. His combat air patrol was scattered after fighting off multiple American attacks, and an enemy fleet of unknown composition was approaching. The admiral's indecision in these crucial minutes would cost Japan the war. The first wave of American carrier aircraft had been launched before dawn, their pilots navigating by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet flew their obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers toward what they knew would be certain death. The slow, cumbersome aircraft, designed in the early 1930s, had no chance against the Japanese Zeros and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the entire enemy fleet. At 0920 hours, Waldron's squadron found the Japanese carriers exactly where intelligence had predicted they would be. The formation of 15 torpedo bombers approached at wavetop level, their crews knowing they were flying into what aviators grimly called the Valley of Death. the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, dove from altitude like hawks attacking mice. The slaughter was systematic and complete. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down by the swarming Zeros, the Devastators, loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes that often failed to explode even when they hit their targets. Had no defensive armament to speak of. Their rear gunners, armed with single .30 caliber machine guns, were helpless against the cannon-armed Japanese fighters. Commander Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall, crashing into the Pacific in a geyser of flame and spray. His body was never recovered, but his final radio transmission was heard by other American pilots. Attack immediately. We're going in. Of the entire squadron, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean with a bullet wound in his leg, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was followed by equally devastating losses from the other American carriers. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise suffered similar casualties, with only 4 of 14 aircraft surviving the encounter. The torpedo bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, fared no better, losing 12 of 13 aircraft in their attack. As recorded in the Naval War College's comprehensive study of the battle, the American torpedo attacks achieved no hits on the Japanese carriers, but they accomplished something far more important. The low-level attacks forced the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. Moreover, the constant maneuvering to avoid torpedoes prevented the Japanese carriers from launching their own strike aircraft against the American fleet. Admiral Nagumo watched the successive American attacks with growing frustration. Each wave of torpedo bombers was destroyed with methodical efficiency, but the attacks were keeping his carriers in a constant state of evasion. His aircraft, crowded on the flight decks and in the hangars below, were sitting ducks. The Admiral needed time to launch his own strike, but the Americans were giving him none. The Japanese carriers continued their violent maneuvering, turning hard to port and starboard to avoid the American torpedoes. The flagship Akagi, with its distinctive flight deck configuration, led the formation through a series of S-turns that kept the American weapons from finding their marks. Behind her, the other carriers Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu followed suit, their wakes creating a pattern of white foam across the blue Pacific. Below decks, Japanese ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the rearming process. The ship's magazines were a maze of activity as sailors hauled torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from storage, while other crews removed the high-explosive bombs that had been intended for the second Midway strike. Aviation gasoline fumes filled the air, and the constant maneuvering made the work dangerous and difficult. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the hero of Pearl Harbor, stood on the Akagi's bridge nursing injuries from the morning's earlier battle. He watched the American attacks with professional admiration, recognizing the desperate courage of the enemy pilots. They keep coming, he murmured to a fellow officer. They must know something we don't. The American sacrifice was about to be rewarded. High above the Japanese fleet, completely undetected by the enemy Combat Air Patrol, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise were approaching their attack position. The Enterprise Air Group had become separated during the morning flight, but McCluskey's navigation skills and determination had brought them to exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. The stage was set for the most decisive 5 minutes in naval aviation history. In the span of a few heartbeats, the entire balance of power in the Pacific would shift irreversibly. The Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, were about to become floating pyres that would mark the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat. At precisely 10:22 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through the clear Pacific air and spotted the Japanese fleet spread out below him like a perfect target. Ray. The Enterprise dive bombers had been searching for over an hour, their fuel gauges approaching the point of no return, when McCluskey made the decision that would change the course of World War II. Instead of following the briefed course, he had turned toward a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward the Arashi, returning from a failed attack on the American submarine Nautilus. The destroyer led McCluskey directly to Admiral Nagumo's carriers, now caught in the most vulnerable position possible. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for the strike. Against the American fleet, aviation gasoline lines snaked across the wooden decks, and ordnance crews were still moving bombs and torpedoes from the magazines. Below, the Japanese combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, was completely out of position to defend against a high-altitude assault. McCluskey's 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack, dived from 14,000 feet, their air-cooled engines screaming as they plunged toward the Japanese fleet. The blue-painted aircraft, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb, the angles approaching vertical. The Japanese sailors below looked up in horror as the American aircraft materialized from the sun. Their dive brakes extended like the wings of birds of prey. The first bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck at exactly 10:26 hours, penetrating the wooden planking and exploding in the upper hangar bay. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and ammunition stored below, creating a chain reaction of explosions that raced through the ship's interior. Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was transformed into a blazing inferno. In a matter of seconds. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown struck the carrier Soryu. With devastating effect, 3 direct hits turned the ship into a floating pyre, her flight deck buckled and burning. The Soryu's aviation gasoline tanks exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen from 50 miles away. Captain Yanagimoto, the ship's commanding officer, chose to go down with his vessel, standing on the bridge as the flames consumed his command. The carrier Kaga, Admiral Nagumo's former flagship, suffered an even more catastrophic fate, for direct hits from Lieutenant Richard Best's section of dive bombers penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces below. The veteran carrier, converted from a battleship hull in the early 1920s, had no compartmentalization to contain the fires. Within minutes, the entire ship was ablaze from stern to stern. The destruction was so complete and so sudden that many Japanese sailors could not comprehend what had happened. Commander Matsuo Fukuda, still recovering from his injuries aboard the Akagi, watched in stunned disbelief as his ship transformed from a proud warship into a burning wreck. The flight deck was a sheet of flame, he would later write. The hangar was a furnace of blazing gasoline and exploding ammunition. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The carefully trained aircrews, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean, were trapped below decks or consumed in the flames on the flight decks above. Years of experience and training were literally going up in smoke as the ships burned out of control. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been steaming separately from the main formation and escaped the initial American attack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, embarked aboard the Hiryu, immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of the situation. With 3 carriers destroyed and Admiral Nagumo's command structure in chaos, Yamaguchi took tactical command of the remaining Japanese forces. The Hiryu's flight deck crews worked with desperate efficiency to launch every available aircraft. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet, determined to extract revenge for the morning's disasters. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, flew with the fury of men who knew their navy was dying beneath them. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform scorched and his flagship burning around him, was finally convinced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. The transfer was conducted under fire, with American aircraft continuing to strafe the burning carriers. As the admiral's launch pulled away from the dying Akagi, he looked back at the ship that had carried him to victory at Pearl Harbor. Now she was a funeral pyre for the Imperial Japanese Navy's dreams of Pacific dominance. The miracle of 5 minutes had destroyed the heart of Japanese naval aviation. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor terrorized the Dutch East Indies and dominated the Indian Ocean were now smoking ruins drifting helplessly on the Pacific swells. The rising sun, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was setting forever on Japan's naval supremacy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as the carrier Hiryu steamed alone through the debris field of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, surveying the destruction with the calm demeanor of a samurai facing death. 3 of the 4 carriers were gone, their smoke columns visible on the horizon like funeral pyres. The Hiryu, last survivor of the Kido Butai, would make Japan's final stand at Midway. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's strike force had located the American fleet at 1400 hours, their Valdiv bombers approaching the carrier Yorktown. Through heavy anti-aircraft fire, the American task force, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, had been expecting retaliation. The Yorktown's Combat Air Patrol, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, rose to meet the Japanese attack with the new Grumman Wildcat fighters. The aerial battle that followed demonstrated the changing nature of Pacific warfare. The Japanese pilots, though skilled and experienced, were outnumbered and facing increasingly sophisticated American defensive tactics. Thatch's beam defense maneuver, later known as the Thatchweave, allowed his Wildcats to provide mutual support against the more maneuverable Zeros. The tactical innovation, developed through months of combat analysis, proved devastating to Japanese formations. Despite the fierce defense, several Japanese bombs found their marks on the Yorktown. The veteran carrier, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, shuddered under the impact of 3 direct hits. Fires erupted on the flight deck, and the ship's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties rushed to contain the blazes. To Japanese observers, the Yorktown appeared to be sinking, her list increasing with each passing minute. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's damage control teams worked with legendary efficiency, demonstrating the superior American approach to ship survivability. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was making 20 knots and preparing to launch aircraft. The rapid repairs were so effective that when the second Japanese strike arrived, the pilots reported attacking a different carrier, not recognizing the ship they had damaged earlier. The second attack, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning strike on Midway, consisted of 10 K torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged in the earlier mission, and his fuel tank was punctured. But the veteran pilot insisted on leading the attack himself. His dedication exemplified the sacrificial spirit that characterized Japanese naval aviation. The torpedo attack pressed home with suicidal determination, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese pilots launched their Type 95 torpedoes at point-blank range. 2 weapons struck the Yorktown's port side, causing massive flooding and knocking out the ship's power systems. This time, the damage was too severe for rapid repair. Captain Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned as she took on an increasingly severe list. As detailed in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative naval history. The loss of the Yorktown was a bitter blow to American morale, but it paled in comparison to the disaster that had befallen the Japanese fleet. The Hiryu, having expended her striking power in the attacks on the Yorktown, now faced the inevitable American retaliation. Admiral Yamaguchi knew that his ship was doomed, but he was determined to fight to the end. The American counterstrike arrived at 1700 hours, launched from the Enterprise and commanded by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher. 24 SPD dauntless dive bombers approached the Hiryu from the southwest, their crews eager to complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. The lone Japanese carrier, accompanied by 2 destroyers and a cruiser, presented a tempting target against the darkening Pacific sky. The attack was executed with the precision that had destroyed the other 3 carriers, for direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck. Her flight deck twisted and her hangar spaces filled with exploding ammunition. The ship's engineering plant remained intact, however, and she continued to make way even as fires consumed her upper works. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing that his ship was beyond saving, made the decision that would immortalize him in Japanese naval history. Rather than abandon the Hiryu, he chose to remain aboard with Captain Tomio Kaku, sharing the fate of their vessel. The admiral's final message to the combined fleet was characteristic of his warrior spirit. "We have fought courageously. We are prepared to crash dive into an enemy carrier if the opportunity arises." As night fell over the Pacific, the Hiryu continued to burn, her fires visible for miles across the dark ocean. The last of Japan's Pearl Harbor carriers was dying, taking with her the dreams of Pacific conquest that had driven the empire into war. The calculated counterattack at Midway had achieved what many thought impossible: the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation's elite striking force. The rising sun flag still flew from the Hiryu's mast, but it was illuminated now by the flames consuming the ship below. Japan's naval supremacy, built over decades of careful planning and training, had been destroyed in a single day of battle. The Pacific night was lit by the funeral pyres of the Japanese fleet as Admiral Yamamoto received the devastating reports aboard his flagship, the super battleship Yamato. The combined fleet commander, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's greatest naval strategist, read the damage reports with growing disbelief. In a single day of battle, the Imperial Navy had lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, and most of its veteran aircrew, the elite pilots who had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, watched his admiral's face as the magnitude of the disaster became clear. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were all destroyed or dying. More critically, the trained pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Indian Ocean were gone forever. Japan's naval aviation, painstakingly built over 20 years, had been destroyed in a few hours of combat. The Yamato steamed through the darkness toward the battle area, her massive 18-inch guns ready for the surface engagement that Yamamoto still hoped to achieve. The combined fleet commander reasoned that if he could bring the American carriers within range of his battleships, he might still salvage something from the disaster. The main body included the Yamato, Mutsu, and Nagato, the most powerful battleships in the Pacific, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. But Admiral Spruance, commanding the American carrier forces after Admiral Fletcher's flagship was crippled, refused to be drawn into a night surface action. The American admiral, demonstrating the tactical caution that would characterize his entire career, withdrew his forces eastward rather than risk his valuable carriers against Japanese battleships in the darkness. The prudent decision ensured that the victory at Midway would not be squandered in a desperate night engagement. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged Yorktown since the afternoon attacks. The American carrier, abandoned by her crew but still afloat, presented an irresistible target. The submarine's periscope cut through the dark water as Tanabe maneuvered into attack position, determined to claim at least one American carrier for the Empire. At dawn on June 6, 1942, Tanabe's torpedoes struck both the Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing salvage assistance. The Hammond broke in half and sank immediately, while the Yorktown, despite surviving multiple air attacks, finally succumbed to the submarine's weapons. The grand old carrier, veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway, rolled over and sank in 3,000 fathoms of Pacific water. The loss of the Yorktown was America's only major casualty in the battle, but it paled in comparison to the destruction of the Japanese fleet. As the sun rose on June 6th, the 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking. The Hiryu, last to die, finally slipped beneath the waves at 0900 hours, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku with her. The 2 officers had chosen to die with their ship rather than face the shame of defeat. Admiral Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his career. The Midway operation had been designed to force a decisive battle with the American Pacific Fleet, but the outcome had been catastrophic for Japan. The admiral, who had warned his government that America's industrial might would eventually prove decisive, now saw his prophecy beginning to unfold. The loss of 4 carriers and their aircrew was a blow from which Japan would never recover. The Strategic implications were immediately apparent to Yamamoto's staff. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken at Midway. The Empire lacked the industrial capacity to replace the lost carriers quickly, and the trained pilots were irreplaceable. The defensive perimeter that Japan had hoped to establish in the Central Pacific was now untenable. The initiative had passed permanently to the Americans. The retreat of the combined fleet was conducted under the cover of darkness, with Yamamoto's battleships and cruisers retiring toward Japan. The admiral's staff worked frantically to assess the damage and plan for the defensive battles that would inevitably follow. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, had been shattered in a single day of combat. As the Japanese fleet limped homeward, American search planes from Midway continued to hunt for stragglers. The cruiser Mikuma, damaged in a collision during the confused night withdrawal, was caught by Marine dive bombers and bombed into a sinking condition. The heavy cruiser, veteran of numerous Pacific campaigns, became another casualty of Japan's Midway disaster. The battle's aftermath would reverberate throughout the Pacific War. Japan's naval aviation, the instrument of conquest that had seemed invincible just days before, was now a shadow of its former self. The empire would fight on for 3 more years, but the outcome of the Pacific conflict had been decided in the skies above Midway. The calculated counterattack had achieved total victory, ensuring that Japan's naval force would never again threaten American control of the Pacific sea lanes. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy, and dawn was breaking on American dominance in the Pacific theater of operations. The gray dawn of June 7, 1942, found Admiral Yamamoto standing alone on the bridge of the Yamato, watching the empty Pacific horizon where his carriers had burned just hours before. The greatest naval strategist in Japanese history faced the bitter truth that his carefully planned operation had not only failed, but had inflicted catastrophic damage on the Imperial Navy's ability to wage war. The 4 carriers lying on the ocean floor represented more than ships. They embodied Japan's hopes for Pacific dominance. The human cost was staggering beyond the mere loss of vessels. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had perished in the battle, including many of the Empire's most experienced carrier pilots. These aviators, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies campaigns, were irreplaceable. Japan's naval aviation training program, though extensive, could not produce pilots of equivalent skill and experience in time to affect the war's outcome. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo painted an even grimmer picture. American industrial capacity, already ramping up for global war, would soon produce carriers, aircraft, and pilots at rates that Japan could never match. The Essex-class carriers under construction in American shipyards would dwarf anything the Japanese could build. The calculated counterattack at Midway had not only destroyed Japan's existing naval aviation, but had guaranteed American numerical superiority for the remainder of the war. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, whose tactical indecision had contributed to the disaster, submitted his resignation to the Naval General Staff. The admiral who had led the Pearl Harbor attack now faced the shame of presiding over the greatest naval defeat in Japanese history. His request was quietly denied. The Navy could not afford to lose experienced commanders, even those who had failed at Midway. The strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the Americans. Admiral Nimitz, reading the battle reports at Pearl Harbor, immediately began planning offensive operations that would have been impossible just days earlier. The Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Marshall Hash, Japan's naval force collapsed completely during Midway's calculated counterattack.